Grams.
It's almost impossible to imagine a world without radio and television. And yet, when you look back, it isn't so long ago since radio could only handle messages by Morse code. And then, dramatically, in 1920, something new happened. We heard for the first time the golden voice of Melba. Amateurs with crystal sets, wireless operators listening from ships at sea. Many of them heard a faraway, distorted voice coming through the air to make history. From the Marconi works at Chelmsford, Melba's voice had been received by hundreds of people, hundreds of miles apart. This story is a tribute to the engineers who not only had the ideas, but also made them work. The story begins for us in 1922, in this hut at Writtle near Chelmsford, when the Postmaster General gave permission for the first regular British broadcast to be made by a group of brilliant young engineers. They transmitted every Tuesday evening, but their programs weren't at all what the Postmaster General had expected.
Hello CQ, this is 2 Emma Talk Writtle testing, this is 2 Emma Talk Writtle testing. TQ, tonight we have a most marvelous thing that's going to happen. We are going to receive Rome. That famous Italian tenor Gridlico is going to sing Non Puto Perore Pantissimo. There may be some atmospherics, but hang on CQ, we're just going to receive it now.
Eckersley, of course, was the comedian and impresario and everything else. He said some most frightful things over the microphone, which we thought were very funny at the time, but ended in quite serious rockets from Marconi House.
And, of course, when we first started the Writtle programs, we didn't really worry at all about rehearsals of any kind.
Which, of course, was entirely a spare-time job. I think we actually got 10 bob a night for doing it or something, but we were everything, you see. We were the program people, the engineers, the studio assistants, the lot.
I thought it was a lot of damn nonsense. I didn't mind the amateurs having calibration signals and all that, but I suppose I was a very serious-minded youth, and I was quite dedicated to the idea that we wireless engineers should do everything to assist a pilot in getting an aircraft to its destination.
After a time, Peter Eckersley decided he'd try and produce a rather serious play.
Well, of course, in those days we had no multi-microphones, and all we had was a microphone, rather like a telephone mouthpiece, which you had to hold to your mouth. Well, in order to have a bit of rehearsal, we sat round our tea table at my digs with a teaspoon, and we held the teaspoon to our mouth like this. One kiss.
One? You ask me for only one? Is that all?
You go too far.
She's willing. why not make the most of it?
Christian, be quiet.
Then come, gather your sacred blossom.
Roxanne. Well, as you can see, it was great fun. I don't know who enjoyed it more, the Riddle engineers or the few listeners that heard it.
It was the most important thing we were doing, and we didn't realize what we were starting.
But, you know, it was quite extraordinary. Even in those days, we used to get lots and lots of postcards from people who, wrote to the perfect voice. Well, of course, you can imagine the argument at Riddle as to who was the perfect voice.
P.P. Eckersley had a special place in the history of broadcasting, not only because of his irreverent approach to programs. It was he who led the team of young men that were to play a vital part in the formation of the British Broadcasting Company's engineering department. With Noel Asbridge, R.T.B. Wynne, B.N. McClarty, and perhaps the most outstanding of them all, H.L. Kirk, Eckersley's job for the Marconi Company had been development and research in the very rapidly expanding field of serious communication.
I think Riddle more or less came to the conclusion that broadcasting was a prostitution of the noble art of radio. That was our idea, anyway. It's funny how it's worked out, isn't it?
The 2LO transmitter was built by the Marconi Company, the research department, and installed on the 7th floor of Marconi House in 1922. The Marconi Company used this transmitter for occasional telephony transmissions during the summer of 22, and when the BBC was formed in November 1922, it was used for the regular programs which started in that month.
Later explained by the first chairman of the new company, Lord Gainford.
Last year, the manufacturers of wireless apparatus met together by invitation of the Post Office, as it was realized that broadcasting would have to be controlled by one broadcasting authority if the chaos which today is so obvious in America were to be avoided here.
The British Broadcasting Company was formed by the 6 big wireless manufacturers, and the first transmission took place from 2LO in Marconi House on the 14th of November 1922. The accommodation in Marconi House was very small, and further accommodation was found in Savoy Hill, and the first studio was opened on the 1st of May 1923. For the whole of this time, of course, Captain Eckersley was the chief engineer under Mr. John Reith, as he then was, as general manager. John Reith had joined the BBC in November 1922. He was, of course, an engineer, a Scottish engineer, and I think it's true to say that from the beginning he had a clear insight of the potentialities of broadcasting in the national life.
From the word go, it was a crashing success. Thousands of people listened in to the new programs. Amateurs sat up far into the night building their own receivers from the latest plans, adding more and more valves, striving for more and more volume and ever greater range. Engineers at their end were encouraged to improve the transmitters. There was tremendous competition among the manufacturers to produce better and cheaper receivers for the listeners who didn't build their own. There was an air of excitement, almost magic about the new wireless that grew and grew, particularly when the loudspeaker took over from the original headphones. To keep pace with all this almost alarming enthusiasm, the young BBC had to grow at an enormous rate. With every manufacturer competing to find the next technical breakthrough, however gimmicky, the new company increased its staff 4 times over in only 2 years. Young engineers with ideas flocked in from all directions to get jobs.
Like so many others who wanted to work in radio, I was a wireless operator at sea. Early in 1923, the ship was coming back home after a 6-month voyage when we ran into a fog off Ushant. As I was writing down the bearings on a clean bit of paper to send to the bridge, I accidentally brushed against the tuning knob of the receiver and was astounded to hear music. So after Radio Watch, 4 of us sat there with single earpieces from dismantled headphones glued to our ears.
I'm rather fond of music myself, and I thought, well, if we can transmit operas like that, and if it can all be very much improved, and I also thought that some kind of a loudspeaker would become freely available, well, then I began to feel rather more convinced about the BBC as a viable concern in the future.
From the start, BBC engineers had 2 aims. The first was to transmit the programs as far as possible so that the maximum number of people could join the audience. And the second was to improve the fidelity of reproduction. And every little helped. Even the warning notice to announcers. If you cough or rustle your papers, you will deafen thousands of people.
The rather strange quality associated with the early broadcasting days was largely due to the fact that we had no microphones or amplifiers suitable for transmitting speech and music.
The story of microphones for broadcasting really begins in the old Riddle days, when all they had was the telephone mouthpiece with carbon granules, the Peel Connor solid back carbon microphone. Of course, the quality wasn't good enough. The background noise produced by the carbon granules was disturbing. If the sound was too loud, you got distortion, which we used to call in those days mic blasting. But it was a microphone like this that made radio history in 1920 when Melba sang at Chelmsford.
The London transmitter 2LO had an output of 1 kilowatt. It's now preserved as a museum piece at Brookman's Park near London.
Now, that valve generated the fundamental carrier wave frequency and was neutralized by an inductive coupling, which was, as we know now, inherently defective. This valve was the main output valve pumping power into the aerial, and here we have the rectifier panel, which has 3 MR6 rectifiers providing the high tension for the main valves. Now, the transmitter was modulated on the choke control or hoisting control system by these 4 valves in parallel. These valves were fed by this valve, which was quaintly known as the submodulator, and that received the program from the microphone amplifier.
By 1923, a much better microphone had been developed, the Brown-Sykes magnetophone. But because of this gauze cover, which served to keep out drafts as well as prying fingers, the thing became known as the meat safe. An interesting feature about this microphone is that the coil itself forms the diaphragm, and the way in which it's fixed into the gap is extremely crude. 3 little pads of cotton wool smeared with Vaseline are all that hold this coil in place. And perhaps it's not surprising that it sometimes fell out during programs.
But we soon realized, even in 1923, that we wanted something rather bigger and better than the transmitter, this lash-up transmitter in Marconi House. So we looked around and eventually found that we were able to build a transmitter on the roof of the Selfridge building in Oxford Street.
With main transmitters already in London, Birmingham and Manchester, the rest of the country was crying out for their share. So they added 6 more, each with a range of 20 miles during the hours of daylight and further at night. But that still left a large area where nothing could be heard at all. To fill in the gaps, they planned no less than 10 low-power relay stations. They put up 2 a month, and by the time they were all in operation, 70% of the population could listen to the program with a crystal set. It was a great technical achievement, carried out in a very short time.
And incidentally would have the great advantage of bringing in a large number of listeners who would, of course, have to buy their licenses and so improve the BBC finances, a very important point in those days.
The national program from London. We begin this evening with a concert by the Gershwin Parkinson Quintet, who will play Liebestraum, Love's Dream by Liszt.
Hitherto, of course, all the transmissions were radiated from the London transmitter only. But in association with post office telephone lines, we were able to send the program not only, of course, to the local transmitter, but to all the other transmitters which were in operation all over the country.
The London control room at Savoy Hill was too small, so it had to be enlarged by knocking down 2 walls and the ceiling. And the biggest job I remember was moving the simultaneous broadcast board. This was a sort of small telephone exchange which connected the control room at Savoy Hill with all the regional stations. There was a big jack field here on this wooden framework which had been erected on an ordinary kitchen table, a large kitchen table complete with a covering of American cloth.
Wavelengths were going to be a very precious commodity, and so much so that there was already at that time interference on the medium wavelengths between various stations. And it was decided then by the BBC to call a conference of the European broadcasters in order that this problem, amongst many others of course, should be sorted out. And that was done, and a union called the International Broadcasting Union was formed and first met in London in 1925. And one of their first tasks was to allocate the medium wavelengths over Europe to the various countries concerned. At the same time, in the same year, Captain Eckersley had the idea that it would be most desirable, in order to cover the country areas, to have a long-wave, high-power transmitter in operation. And we decided to build at Daventry in the center of England. It had a range of about 100 to 150 miles, and it brought in a very large part of the country which hitherto had not been properly served.
This combination of high power and long waves was a great advance, and the much larger audience gave radio its first big opportunity. When the general strike hit Britain in 1926, newspapers vanished, and radio suddenly became the only means of communication left. And the BBC News was of vital importance.
This is 5PY calling. Here are some items of local news received from official sources. Recruiting for the maintenance of vital services has begun. Milk and food supply arrangements are working according to plan, and listeners are assured that food is abundant in all districts.
Radio finally came of age when Mr. Baldwin, the Prime Minister, faced a microphone for the first time to explain the crisis. This first ministerial broadcast, on May the 11th, 1926, proved that in only 4 years, wireless had become accepted as a vital part of everyday life. On New Year's Day, 1927, the old company ceased to exist, and the British Broadcasting Corporation was born to take its place, backed by a royal charter and a new motto: Nation shall speak peace unto nation. For the engineers, the change made very little immediate difference. The high-power transmitter at Daventry had proved a success. The complex network of landlines which the post office had developed for distributing programs was also well established. But there was more to do. Eckersley firmly believed that receivers could select between 2 programs coming from one station. A lot of people thought this was impossible, but the engineers went ahead and built, alongside the existing long-wave transmitter, an experimental medium-wave, high-power transmitter at Daventry, so that the old could continue to transmit the national, and the new would take the regional program. It worked. Eckersley was right, and by careful tuning, the listeners could change from one program to the other. This was the beginning of the regional scheme. Using Daventry as a prototype, the BBC opened the first transmitter ever designed to carry two programs at once. It was here at Brookman's Park. It was built over 40 years ago and was so well designed that this same transmitter can still work to this day. Even now its reliability is such that it has never been out of action for more than 23 minutes of program time in any year. It had a new design of water-cooled valves that gave it the unheard-of power of 50 kilowatts. It still has its own independent power supply for use in emergencies. But Brookman's Park was only the start. Within 10 years, they had built 12 more regional transmitters. There was Washford, Moorside Edge, Droitwich, Stagshaw, Westerglen, Start Point, and 6 more. Thus, the two programs, regional and national, became available to most of the country. The engineers had established the pattern of broadcasting for years to come. The problem was learning how to use it.
Here, putting the world right on broadcasting itself, is Mr. George Bernard Shaw.
The politicians have not yet found out the microphone. They still imagine that they are addressing political meetings. And they don't understand that the microphone is the most wonderful telltale in the world. If you speak insincerely to a political, say an election audience, the more insincere you are, the more hopelessly you're away from all the facts of life, the more they'll cheer you and the more they're delighted. But if you try that on the microphone has a certain magic. It gives you away instantly.
Whatever traps the politicians fell into, the audience obviously approved. In 10 years, licenses had increased nearly 300 times, and radio manufacture had become a big business. Now, in the meantime, broadcasting had expanded and developed so much since the general strike that it was necessary to find new premises. And finally, a site was found near All Souls Church in Langham Place, at the very top of Regent Street. And on May the 15th, 1932, the new headquarters of the BBC were opened at Broadcasting House. Although the BBC had actually grown out of its new home even before they moved in, it was a tremendous advance. Designed by Marmaduke Tudsbury, who was later much involved in the building of Television Centre, it was the first specially built broadcasting headquarters in the world. For those of us who worked there before the war, it contained more facilities than any of us had dreamed possible, combined with an atmosphere that demanded total respect and dedication. The opening celebrations ended with Henry Hall and his dance band in Studio 8A.
Program for tonight. Good night, everybody. Good night.
The engineers now directed their attention to shortwaves. With directional aerials, they bounced radio waves off the ionosphere and transmitted programs to the other side of the world. 1932 was a period of rapid expansion. Experimental shortwave transmissions had already taken place from Daventry, and on December the 19th, John Reith inaugurated the Empire Service, to become known as the Girdle Round the World.
This occasion is as significant as any in the 10 years of British broadcasting. From today, programs will be broadcast regularly from the Empire Station.
Through one of the marvels of modern science, I am enabled this Christmas Day to speak to all my peoples throughout the empire. I speak now from my home and from my heart to you all. To men and women so cut off by the snows, the desert, or the sea, that only voices out of the air can reach them.
The studios in Broadcasting House were designed structurally as studios, in their position in the building, their soundproofness, and above all, their air conditioning. I think the air conditioning was the most important advantage compared with the Savoy Hill studios. A lot of the Broadcasting House studios were quite new in their acoustic treatment. I think in general the Broadcasting House studios could have been criticized as being a little too reverberant in the bass. They were a bit boomy. But they were comfortable to work in, and the technical equipment, of course, was something we had a lot of fun and excitement in developing.
With the move from Savoy Hill to Broadcasting House, we had one considerable advantage in the drama department, insofar that the engineers took the greatest trouble to consult us over the construction and design of the studios.
Most elaborate sound effects studios were built. They contained a number of gadgets such as water tanks, wind machines, and of course an assortment of portable doors with various handles. Many years later, one of these became famous.
Can I do your nails, sir?
I'll try my Wall Street account. Now, let me see.
And of course, everything had to be done in the studio, live.
Because nobody wanted the 8th floor, it had a mansard roof. Naturally, the engineers were told to use it. That was fairly standard practice. And I can see it now, bays and bays of rack-mounted equipment, which, from the engineering point of view, in performance, I mean, in its frequency response and its distortion characteristics and so forth, was magnificent.
The engineer's ear is a little different from the musician's ear. It's not that he's listening for different things so much as that he is rating certain aspects of it as more important than we do, perhaps. I remember very well that in the middle of a crescendo, it wasn't blatant. It was certainly perceptible, but it wasn't, as I say, blatant. Somebody had brought it down a little on the way up in the crescendo. RTB Wing wouldn't swallow that, and he taught me to listen most carefully for that kind of thing.
The cream of British musicians, 400 of them in every orchestral combination, put the whole range of music at the service of the listener.
You see, music has gone to millions of people who would never have touched it otherwise, I think, because it's come out in their homes. And that, I think, we must say the credit goes to the BBC.
This organ building, Hartley, in which you just discovered me, was not very much like what I was doing in 1932. With sound broadcasting firmly established in the BBC, the corporation had come to the conclusion that it was high time they started in television.
Baird was working on a 30-line mechanical system of television in his laboratories in Longacre in London. So Noel Ashbridge, Harold Kirk and I went along to see how he was getting on, and all that we saw was a blurred image of a puppet's head. And I think we realized then that this system was unlikely to be suitable for a public television service.
However, in 1932, the BBC did finally succumb to public pressure. They agreed to put out a nightly test transmission from Broadcasting House. These simple programs went on for nearly 3 years.
Although opinions differ, perhaps Baird's two main contributions were, first, to show that television was a possibility, secondly, to arouse public interest and to stimulate others to develop new and better systems.
In 1930, we knew that the EMI company were working on the development of an electronic system of television. They had a brilliant research team headed by Sir Isaac Schoenberg, of whom perhaps Blumlein and Brown were the two principal engineers concerned. And in 1932, they demonstrated this system to us, and we were very greatly impressed with its potentialities.
The circuitry of their camera was far more advanced than anything known. Within a short time, the EMI team had produced a viable system using 405 lines. It was the Selsdon Committee, appointed by the government, that recommended, in 1935, that transmission should begin at Alexandra Palace. The BBC were to try out both the EMI and an improved Baird system on alternate weeks. This started on November the 2nd, 1936, but in a very short time, the Baird system was dropped, and the EMI was left as the one chosen for the first regular high-definition television service in the world.
This, then, is the moment to have a look at one of the actual cameras which the BBC used in opening the 405-line television service. The camera contained a camera tube called a standard Imatron. Light is focused onto that target through the lens from the scene. And onto the target is projected a stream of electrons from a gun down here. And this stream of electrons moves across the target just as the eye moves in reading a page of a book which might contain 405 lines of print. And from the tube there comes a current of electricity which represents the detail in the scene.
By perfecting a reliable camera, the engineers had paved the way for a dramatic advance. It became possible to bring the immediacy of great events into the home. In May 1937, the very first television outside broadcast was set up at Hyde Park Corner, the coronation of George VI.
This was a wholly engineering operation with the help of staff from EMI who had built the equipment and delivered it just in time. Particularly, of course, we wanted a close-up view of His Majesty in the royal coach as he came in the procession, which came down this East Carriage Drive, and we had been told that His Majesty would be sitting on our side of his coach, and to our great delight, the King did look towards us.
Now, whilst the first television outside broadcast was taking place from Hyde Park Corner, sound radio also had its biggest day and its greatest progress. For many commentators were scattered over the route on that day, this was one of the positions here where we could look directly at Buckingham Palace, and we saw the royal coach come out there on its way to Westminster Abbey, and then it went down, straight down here, down the Mall to Admiralty Arch, and then on its way into the Abbey itself. Now, I think that really this was the period and a particular day on which that tremendous cooperation laid down by RTB Wynn between the engineering division and the program division really bore its full fruit.
1 out, 2 out, 3 out.
Then came one of the greatest achievements in engineering, and that was this. The lip microphone. The microphone you held up to your face like that and you talked directly into it. It enabled you to stand by ringside at a boxing match or even in a crowded football match. You didn't hear the cheering crowd, you didn't hear the banging of the drums and the rattles. It was in the background only, but the voice of the commentator could always be heard. This was a tremendous advance for all commentators. But at that time also, there were no such things as recordings. So that everything you did had to go out live to everybody listening. And you didn't do it right, well, you couldn't do it again.
And there's something more important. If you nerve yourself to face the microphone by taking, say, half a glass of whiskey, the effect produced is that you're shockingly drunk.
At the present moment, the whole fleet is lit up. When I say lit up, I mean lit up by fairy lamps. I was talking to you in the middle of this in the middle of this fleet. It's gone. It's gone. There's no fleet. It's disappeared. No magician who ever could have waved his wand could have waved it with more.
That transmission was finally cut by engineers, which of course was quite wrong. Now, when you start to think that an engineer had to cut a thing like that, more or less without the program people being able to give him orders, it wasn't a brave piece of work by the engineers, it was just something very cumbersome in the design of the equipment.
To put matters right, special continuity suites were built, and the smooth running of the programs became the responsibility of the presentation announcer. By now, radio in other countries had become a political power. Hitler was blatantly using radio as a propaganda machine to further his aims for the domination of Europe. The corporation realized there was a vital need to extend their overseas services, and foreign language programs started in 1938. They built more transmitters and quickly brought into operation a number of powerful medium and shortwave stations. If war came, the BBC were going to be prepared. They made plans for the quick change of transmitter networks so that the enemy wouldn't be able to use them for navigation. At Wood Norton in Warwickshire, they set up a special centre as a wartime broadcasting headquarters. On September the 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland and the whole television service closed down.
For the second time in the lives of most of us, we are at war. Over and over again, we have tried to find a peaceful way out of the differences between ourselves and those who are now our enemies.
Facing the dangers of war, the BBC desperately needed to make use of sound recording. Primitive machines had existed since 1932, and now every one was pressed into service. This old Blattner was brought out of retirement at Wood Norton and used to record Chamberlain's speech.
Up to the very last, it would have been quite possible to have arranged a peaceful and honorable settlement between Germany and Poland. But Hitler would not have it.
The engineers christened this machine the Red Devil, and it used over a mile of steel tape every half hour. But it did work, and with the later Marconi Stiller and the long-playing disc, it helped the BBC to redeploy its program facilities completely. Broadcasting House was bombed, but not one program ever failed to reach the people listening at home.
Going up there. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, there are about 10 German machines dive-bombing a British convoy, which is just out to sea in the Channel. As here they come in absolute steep dive, and you can see their bombs actually leave the machines and come into the water. You can hear our own guns going like anything now. No, we thought he got a German one had been got then, but now the British fighters are coming up. That was a bomb, as you may imagine. There's one coming down in flames. Somebody's hit a German, and he's going down completely out of control, and he's going slap into the sea, and there he goes, smash!
Despite all the bombs dropped on London and the regional centres, the BBC was never put off the air altogether. The engineers were reduced in numbers, but they nevertheless developed and expanded the shortwave service to transmit news of the war to the rest of the world. Perhaps their biggest single contribution was the building of the highest-powered transmitter ever designed. This was put up at Ottringham, near Hull, in 1943, and with a huge output of 800 kilowatts, it blasted its messages and propaganda into occupied Europe. Wood Norton became one of the biggest broadcasting centres in Europe, pumping out 835 hours of programmes every week. The BBC's monitoring service listened and reported to the government on thousands of broadcasts from all over the world and sifted millions and millions of words. It turned out to be vitally important. And so did the ordinary programmes put out every day. The Home and Forces programmes boosted the morale of a population totally involved in waging war.
to the National Gallery for our lunchtime concert. Dame Myra Hess is the soloist.
Tide began to turn and the British forces went on the offensive at last, the BBC went with them. I was a war correspondent. Our problem in North Africa with the 8th Army was not only to get the story, but to get the story all the way back to London. Now, we had in the desert with us a BBC recording truck. It was a 3-ton truck. We called it Belinda. And on this recording gear, we could record our stories, and then the discs had to be sent somehow back to Cairo, and then they were beamed by shortwave radio to London, and from London broadcast to the world. And that was a lengthy process. And in Italy, our problems with communication were even more serious. And I got out Mr. Haley, William Haley, who'd become editor-in-chief of the BBC, so that he could see on the spot exactly the problems we were up against. And he went back to England, and he went to the War Office and persuaded the War Office that in the plans for the landings in Normandy, accommodation must be provided for a fleet of BBC vehicles which would include mobile transmitters and mobile recording trucks to enable us to be in instant communication with London with our dispatches.
The invasion of Europe on June the 6th, 1944 was one of the best kept secrets of the war. I didn't myself know until a few hours before the announcement went out that it was on. Now, the announcement is not made from Broadcasting House. It is made from Chafe Headquarters, which is in Mallet Street in the centre of London, where, under the command of Leslie Houghton, the senior superintendent engineer, a small studio and a cubicle had been set up. And it was at 9:32 in the morning that communique number 1 came from that building and was sent direct to Broadcasting House, and from there distributed to all transmitters of the BBC and to United Nations Radio Mediterranean.
Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France.
Directly after the reading of communique number 1 came what was called the alerting period. Now, this meant that each nation was to hear in its own language the announcement of D-Day, and this also meant that the engineers had to break up the entire network to individual transmitters. This was a terrific undertaking by the engineering division, probably one of the most complicated ever done in the whole world of broadcasting.
And in addition to everything else, we had for the first time really portable recording equipment we could carry with us right forward into the most advanced positions. This instrument, the portable recording device of 1944, a disc recorder with a 10-inch disc on it, spring wound, easily operated. You simply turned a knob here, that set the turntable revolving, and with all this equipment that we had, we were able to send back to London transmissions of first-class quality. And this was a vast improvement over our circumstances in North Africa and Italy, where only too often, when our recordings reached London, the engineers ruled them out for broadcasting on grounds of technical quality, and announcers had to read our dispatches for us at the microphone. That never happened once we got into Europe.
Hello, BBC. This is Frank Gillard here, recording just outside Tilly, a mile or two back from Tilly, on Friday morning, June the 16th, during a barrage which is being laid down to prepare the way for an infantry attack on a small village just to the east of Tilly.
We, the radio correspondents, followed the advance right through Western Europe. We reported every setback and every victory, so that it was possible for people at home not only to know the facts, but to hear them at first hand. And when at last victory came, it was possible, thanks to radio, for every person in the country to share the celebration.
When the celebrations were over, broadcasting faced a new and equally difficult challenge: to cater for a peacetime audience still suffering under the weight of austerity. The challenge was accepted by Sir William Haley, who promised that broadcasting would return to normal within 90 days. Television was to reopen. At Alexandra Palace, all the equipment had been stored throughout the war. Now it had to be dug out, dusted down and made to work again. It was a superhuman effort, but the engineers did it. New programs were planned, rehearsed and produced, and for the handful of viewers who still had working receivers, television went on the air again. Engineers coming back from the war found opportunities not only in television, but also in radio, where plans were going ahead for a new third program. New equipment to be built and installed to carry the proposed VHF transmissions that were to revolutionize sound radio reception in the 50s. For engineers, there was no time to relax or even draw breath after the strain of wartime. For many people, the greatest challenge of all lay in the future of television. From here on, the needs of producers and the ideas and skills of engineers began to achieve far-reaching results, particularly in outside broadcasts. With extraordinary initiative and invention, the engineers catered for demands put on them. Perhaps the biggest advance was in 1950, when the BBC finally opened new studios at Lime Grove, taking over the old sound stages left behind by Gaumont British Films. Work went ahead on engineering projects that would revolutionize studio technique. Camera tubes became progressively smaller and more sensitive, and the use of tape recording sound was developed and perfected as a prelude to the time when the first experiments could go ahead with videotape, recording both sound and picture on the same magnetic tape. In the meantime, a special tele-recording camera was developed to preserve programs permanently on film. The coverage of television finally moved out to serve more than just the London area. In 1949, the coaxial cable laid between London and the new Sutton coalfield transmitter provided two-way communication. And not only could Birmingham take programs from London, but also pictures could be transmitted in the south from cameras based in the Midlands. From the point of view of outside broadcasts, it was an advance that enormously increased the scope of program makers and planners. The range of the roving eye was vastly increased. Almost all programs were still transmitted live as they happened, but surprisingly few mistakes found their way onto the air. Considering the complexity of television, this was no mean feat. Risks were taken every day, and when cameras crossed the channel in 1952, outside broadcasts prepared for their most daring adventure. In terms of modern television, Calais doesn't seem a very great excursion, but with the available equipment at that time, it was a monumental undertaking. Signals were sent by microwave, and the audience sat transfixed by the magic of seeing what was actually happening at that moment, far away in France. With Europe working on 625 lines, and Britain at 405, the interchange of programs across the channel required a machine to convert the signal from one system to the other. Once again, the BBC came up with the answer. By 1953, television was ready to face its greatest challenge and transmit the results to Europe. Britain was about to celebrate the coronation at Westminster Abbey of Queen Elizabeth II. Tele-recorded at the time, the quality was remarkable. It was watched by the biggest ever audience, not only in Britain, but in Europe too. In Holland, screens were put up in the street so that the Dutch crowds could share in the ceremony. Dutch television sent a telegram to the BBC. "We are deeply impressed by the coronation of your young and beloved Queen Elizabeth II. May her reign be most blessed for the British people, and may it contribute to the protection of the freedom of the world." Perhaps with the advent of commercial television introduced in the 50s, and now colour, it is natural that we should take broadcasting very much for granted. But surely it is worth remembering that we are only able to accept it as part of our lives because of the work done by the engineers who produced the technical perfection we now enjoy.
Coming to 2. Take it.
When we look back at the technical achievements brought about since that group of men first started at Writtle, it makes one wonder what more there can be yet to come.
I think Writtle more or less came to the conclusion that broadcasting was a prostitution of the noble art of radio. That was our idea, anyway. It's funny how it's worked out, isn't it?
Q grams and mix. Super roller.